Well, good afternoon and welcome to the University of Washington Botanic Gardens and NHS Hall, where we're going to make this afternoon's presentations. My name's Tom Hinckley and I'm the Interim Director for the School of Forest Resources. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the United Nations declared 2011 as the International Year of Forests. And very early in the year, the school, namely Mac Hoagland, who's an affiliate member, decided we ought to take advantage of this theme and work out a series of events that we would hold throughout the year. So this Denman lecture is just one part of a theme, and I'll talk more about the context for the theme. But we're today going to have sort of vignettes into a whole set of projects that we have that involve some aspect of international presence or a history of international connections. And so let's begin. There's a long-term tradition within the former College of Forest Resources and now School of Forest Resources in hosting international students, but around 1960, at least for the date that I could find, was sort of our beginning, sort of big entrance into an international arena, when the University of Washington, through the College of Forestry at the time, hosted the 5th World Forestry Congress on campus. And there's an international grove of trees over by Condon Hall along the boulevard there that they were planted as a result of that particular Congress. Members of then the college were instrumental in establishing the Organization for Tropical Studies, which now continues as hosted at Duke University, but it was originally hosted by the University of Washington. Dean Bethel and Bill Hathaway were instrumental in that. In 1984, then Dean Thorold worked with the state legislature to initiate the Center for International Trade and Forest Products. Thanks to Ivan Easton, which you'll hear about later, we host the Peace Corps Masters International Program. And more recently, we've hosted through the National Science Foundation a series of integrated graduate education and research training endeavors, urban ecology with host countries of Germany and Norway, and the multinational collaborations on challenges to the environment, which hosted many nations around the world. So we'll learn more about those today. Back to the International Year of Forest, sort of the first event was Sustaining Our Northwest World lecture series by Nalini Nadkarni, and then just Friday of last week, 3 distinguished alums came and provided really insights to both their careers and their engagement in the international setting. And the Denman series today is a continuation of this theme. And then in the fall, there will be an exchange with the University of British Columbia, and that will probably be the last sponsored event. We have a lot of examples. Nalini Nadkarni's head poking out through a tropical canopy is one, but we have many more recent endeavors where either individual faculty and staff or groups of students are going internationally and spending anywhere from a week to a year and engaging in research, teaching, or other sort of engagement in an international setting. And we want to talk about those particular examples today. We're very thankful to Bob Edmonds, faculty, and Ellen Matheny, staff, for organizing this particular session. And as Bob has already outlined, there's going to be 3 parts to the sessions, a series of talks, then followed by transition, and then at the very end, we'll come back for questions. Once again, welcome, and thank you for attending this afternoon's meeting. Bob?
Thanks, Tom. The first session this afternoon is going to be International Interdisciplinary Education and Research. And I have the pleasure to introduce Tom, who's going to give our first talk. So Tom Hinckley is a professor of ecophysiology and the Interim Director in the School of Forest Resources. He has a BA from Carleton College and a PhD from the University of Washington. And his research interests are woody plant ecophysiology, stress and carbon physiology, subalpine and alpine ecosystems and mountain communities. And he's had a considerable amount of international experience in both research and education. And this afternoon he's going to give us a talk on interinstitutional education, lessons from an NSF IGERT. So Tom.
I was very fortunate to be part of an IGERT. And an IGERT is sort of an experiment that the National Science Foundation conducts in interdisciplinary research and graduate education. So I'm going to tell you about some of the lessons that we learned as a result of this multi-year participation in this IGERT. A little bit of the history of this particular IGERT. It was first funded in late 2003. 3 cohorts of students were then interviewed and selected, and the first cohort began in 2004, another cohort in 2005, the final cohort in 2006, and it's this final cohort and the particular set of instructions that they received that I'm going to focus on today. It's important to understand of these 30 students, each student had access to 2 years of NSF funding at a considerable benefit, as well as about $8,500 for their international work. The IGERT just ended in January of 2011, so we're having sort of a retrospective look at this particular IGERT. The broad goals of the IGERT were to broaden the doctoral experience. These are NSF level goals, to build research relationships between disciplines, institutions, and nations, and to contribute new research towards solving complex environmental problems. The particular what we call the multinational collaboration, multinational collaborations on challenges to the environment, hence the MCCE acronym. The particular trainee experience that we wanted to give these students wanted to introduce them to a course of study in which they built expertise in indeed crossing all these different boundaries or borders, the international one, the disciplinary one, and the institutional one. And in order to do this, we had specific objectives or specific steps in the course that we offered. It was a trans-boundary orientation field trip at the beginning. There was a set of instruction that covered 3 academic quarters. There was a short international team pilot study, and then it was followed by, on a student-by-student basis, a 6 to 12 months international research experience or internship. So this is sort of the class of 2006, 2007, and there are really important things to note as how broadly interdisciplinary they are. So we had students from civil and environmental engineering, material science and engineering. We had anthropologists, resource economists, biology, a suite of students that would then came in from their own disciplinary backgrounds to spend the next academic year together working to learn. And what we're going to look at is what unfolds as we go through this interdisciplinary trail. This happens to be at Manning Park on our transboundary trip. So there was a fall orientation transboundary field trip which focused on the Columbia Highlands and specifically how the state of Washington and the province of British Columbia look at this particular ecogeographic zone. And we interviewed stakeholders from a wide range of different areas that occupied both sides of this artificial boundary in trying to understand the political, ecological, social, and cultural factors that influence the issues surrounding the Columbia Highlands. There was a year-long coursework, and then during spring break or during the summer, there were 2 international trips, one to New Zealand and the other to China. Now, it's important to understand that this course, this is the 3rd in a series of endeavors in training graduate students. And the first two training periods were all run by faculty. And one of the things that we learned from that was faculty are not particularly good at designing interdisciplinary, interinstitutional, and international particular programs. So we enlisted two graduate students, one in anthropology, one in education, both of whom had been cohort 1 and cohort 2 students, to work with us to design cohort 3's particular suite of studies. And this then is the result of that outcome. So the questions, the specific questions that we're raising are, what are the most significant environmental problems we face today? And how do those get defined by disciplines? And how do those get defined by nations and by institutions, basically? What kinds of boundaries do we face in addressing environmental problems? What kinds of research questions do environmental problems generate? And again, looking at these from interdisciplinary as well as disciplinary perspective. What constitute effective and ethical environmental research? What constitute effective and ethical environmental education? And how do our responses to these questions vary depending upon social context? So you can see it's a really broad exploration. So here's the Columbia Highlands field trip. You can see all sort of symbols from all the different stakeholders that we engaged with. And then we had a sort of a final workshop at University of British Columbia with Simon Fraser University. So to facilitate interdisciplinary learning, we went through a series of specific steps. And these were sort of, what is a discipline? What's the nature of the discipline? What's the language of the discipline? What's the place where disciplines work? So we had exchange lab visits. What's the language of the discipline? And then once you sort of understand what your discipline is and its stereotypes and images, then we move into the sort of interdisciplinary components of that. And I will show you, illustrate some of those sort of specific features that we're going to want to talk about. So the first was an examination of disciplines, and then building from disciplines, how do you build multidisciplinary interactions, and then finally transdisciplinary interactions. All of this based on real-world examples, inviting people from around the campus and around the community in, and also actually using an extensive literature base to explore these particular topics. So I'm going to use one student's example. Pat Schomburger was a material science and engineering student, and he did what's called the exploration of the academy by going and sitting in on lectures by experts from biology, anthropology, geology. These are all people outside of his fields of material science and engineering. And his job was also to interview these speakers to get a sense of their language, get a sense of their use of methods, their use of how they use particular things like PowerPoint to give talks. In a sense, you're trying to learn how a discipline thinks and functions, and you're coming from outside that discipline to understand, in a sense, by looking at the discipline. And Pat had sort of some really interesting views then of two different ways that interdisciplinarity could come together. So we have a picture here, a series of glaciers in a series of cirques, and each cirque represents a discipline. And these cirques then, coming in a downstream fashion, flow together to focus on the interdisciplinary topic of conservation. So this is one way that interdisciplinarity occurs, and this was his sort of representation of how that was. So each student was asked to express their particular, how they saw interdisciplinary functioning. So they talked about feeding this collaboration, and it tends to be, in this particular case, project-oriented. Another way you can look at it is from a transdisciplinary perspective, is that the disciplines rise along ridges in this case, staying with the geological analogy, along ridges to arrive at the main ridge where in summation they become transformative in nature. So rather than interdisciplinary, you're now looking at transformative, transdisciplinary kinds of both research and collaboration. This then involves new methods, new areas of knowledge, and most importantly, it's the most unstable, and you can visualize that geologically, that's unstable, but it's also unstable as sort of a context. A list of the speakers that participated in this, and you can see we utilized not only the campus, but the broad community to achieve these. So we went through a whole series of course material in order to arrive then at these team-based international studies. So students were divided into teams. There was a New Zealand team, Team Kiwi. There was a China team, Team Wajiao. And these two teams worked for several quarters to put together a proposal, vet the proposal, and then would go on that particular international trip. And here's Team Kiwi over spring break in New Zealand studying Didymo, or not so fondly referred to as rock snot, as a invasive organism in New Zealand. And then Team Wajiao in Zhouzigo National Park in China after the quarter had ended in June. There was a contrast between these two teams, and therefore there were different outcomes, different positive results as a result of the background. So the Team Wajiao, who went to China, had the advantage of a long-term history, a previous trip by graduate students to China, a strong partnership with the university in China and with the national park itself, and a chance to vet their particular proposal. Whereas for Team Kiwi, it was the first time any of the participants, including the faculty member, had ever been to New Zealand. The host there wasn't particularly welcoming, and therefore there was a much greater sort of self-reliance in a sense, much more effort for them as a group and individuals to pull this off, and they prepared a synthesis paper, whereas in contrast, Team Wajiao produced a whole series of really relevant publications because of this foundation that had been built. So one of the really important things, if you're going to participate in international work, having a foundation beforehand is really clearly very, very beneficial. This is a global diagram of where students from this particular IGERT have done both their short-term projects as well as their long-term stays. And you can see there's lots of red arrows indicating the longer-term stays over a good part of the globe. So we've garnered sort of a fair amount of information. And you're going to hear later about two of these specific experiences, one from Lauren Urgenson and the other from Julie Combs. And Julie specifically spent 6 months in South Africa, 6 months in South America, most of the time in Chile. And again, very positive results as a result of their work in these international experiences. So we have a bar graph here, and if you look at the bar graph, the top bar coming down from the top, the black bar is the response of students in this particular IGERT. The next bar down, which is sort of a light gray, is just IGERTs in general. So the National Science Foundation had conducted this particular questionnaire. And then the sort of darker gray bar below that is just a traditional PhD program. So this is sort of a double contrast, a contrast between an IGERT in general and traditional PhD programs, and then a contrast between a general PhD program and other IGERTs and this particular IGERT. Not much difference on working with multi-disciplines between the IGERTs, but some difference between traditional PhD programs as one might expect. Team projects is the next category down. Again, differences and this particular IGERT is beginning to separate from other IGERTs. As you go down this list, you will notice of different sort of experiences that PhD students might have in a program. You notice that the difference between this particular IGERT and other ways of garnering PhDs increases. So the final point, which is probably the strongest point that came out of here, the opportunity to work with scientists in other countries, you can see is the most strongly realized outcome that it makes this particular IGERT unique. So it's important to have this kind of information, and this is a response of 27 of the 30 students that were associated with the IGERT. So what are the interdisciplinary lessons that were learned from this particular IGERT? It takes time to build interdisciplinary teams. You have to spend time working, socializing, building trust, and building a mutual understanding. And this is really, I'm surprised as I continue to work in the academy and the university, how difficult it is for people who, when they put a neurobiologist and a cell biologist together and say that's an interdisciplinary experience, and when we put somebody from the School of Social Work together with somebody in electrical engineering, I say that's an interdisciplinary experience. And it takes time to cross all these various boundaries. Teamwork skills are really important and working on them. Being a participant in adaptive management is really critical. And then finally, respect, and this applies both between disciplines but also between institutions and between countries. That is, respect for other ways of knowing is really important. There were lessons learned about doctoral education in general. Doctoral students want to engage in real in-depth work, not busy work. So it's really important that whatever program you design, such as a special program that an IGERT houses, have this kind of really meaningful in-depth work. They need more hands-on training and teamwork, applied research, and all of the what I call the inter-I methods, inter-institutional, international, and interdisciplinary. So the students need lots of work on this. And faculty, interestingly, need obviously even more work on that. IGERT expectations often conflict with the particular expectations that the department has. We had several students that had to change advisors because their advisor told them, quote, your work on this IGERT won't get me promoted. So there is that inherent conflict. And finally, you need funding, mentorship, and not make work in order to make a successful PhD program using this kind of model. This is, for us, a really great experience. For me, it's probably been, over my academic career, probably the most fun I've had and the most enjoyment and sort of learning I have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And following on in this session on international education and research, we're going to hear next from Lauren Urgenson, who is a doctoral candidate in restoration ecology in the School of Forest Resources. And she has a BS in conservation biology from the University of Maryland and an MS from the University of Washington. And her research is focused on the ecological and social dimensions of restoration, with a specific focus on non-native plant invasions in riparian systems. And she's been supported on an NSF IGERT fellowship, and she's going to present part of her dissertation work conducted in South Africa, where she worked in partnership with natural and social scientists at the University of Stellenbosch Center for Invasion Biology and the National Working for Water program. And the title of her talk is Making Restoration Work on Private Land in the Western Cape, South Africa, a multiple stakeholder approach. Lauren.
So many of you are familiar with the term ecosystem services, I'm sure. These are the material and non-material benefits that humans derive from nature. Now, ecosystem service concepts are increasingly important worldwide as a means of aligning restoration with socioeconomic decisions related to the environment. A key aspect of these programs is the incorporation of restoration into working production and residential landscapes. Many of these landscapes are privately owned. Thus, a key question for ecosystem services becomes, how do you engage private landowners in restoration on their property? Now, there's two important but commonly overlooked steps in answering this question. One, gain an enhanced understanding of public values, perceptions, and needs. And then two, to incorporate that information directly into restoration strategies. So the work I'll be discussing today really focuses on the first step of this process. And I conducted this work in the Western Cape of South Africa. The Western Cape is the southern province in South Africa. It's at the southern tip of Africa. It's an agricultural center in the country, and it's a hot spot for biodiversity and ecosystem services with one of the highest concentrations of endemic plant species worldwide. Vegetation, the dominant vegetation in the Western Cape is a fynbos ecosystem, which is dominated by shrubs including proteas, grasses, and forbs. And the Western Cape is a primary source of water resources within the country. The Western Cape is not without its challenges. The majority of the landscape has been transformed, with only 3% located in protected areas. Additionally, although the Western Cape is one of the wealthiest provinces in South Africa, it still faces significant challenges with socioeconomic disparity, unemployment, and poverty. The Western Cape is also highly invaded by non-native invasive plants, as is throughout the country. And these are one of the largest impacts to biodiversity and ecosystem services throughout the province. Now, when I'm talking about invasive plants, what they have is largely invasive trees, so acacia, eucalyptus, pine trees that come from other Mediterranean systems like Australia. Now, these trees displace the unique biodiversity of the Western Cape, and also they take up much more water than the native species due to higher evapotranspiration rates at the stand level. These invasive trees also increase fire frequency and fire intensity in the areas where they invade. And many of the species are stimulated by fire. Thus, their populations continue to increase and lead to further losses of ecosystem services. So in 1995, the South African government formed the Working for Water program as a means to combine socioeconomic development with restoration through the hiring of currently unemployed citizens to remove invasive plants from along waterways and other ecologically sensitive habitats. Now, Working for Water has become one of the largest ecosystem service programs and most successful ecosystem service programs worldwide. They create over 18,000 jobs per year, and they've cleared over 1 million hectares of invasive plants. There's other socioeconomic development benefits, like they hire 52% women, and they create secondary industries from the wood biomass. However, a key limiting factor to Working for Water's meeting their long-term goals is a lack of landowner involvement. As I said, the majority of the landscape is privately owned. So unless landowners are clearing invasive plants on their property, these species will remain on the landscape and continuously reinvade cleared areas. So in order to address this key limitation to the program, in 2008, Working for Water proposed a new approach to engaging private landowners in restoration through the clearing of invasive plants on their property. This approach combined both incentives through financial incentives and management assistance with disincentives through the application of regulations in order to engage landowners in clearing invasive plants on their property and to empower landowners to feel like they can take responsibility for maintaining the work on their property over the long term. The specific financial incentive proposed by Working for Water would be over a fixed time frame. They said we'll cover 100% of the herbicide costs for 4 clearings, and we'll cover a decreasing percentage of the labor costs over that same time frame. In exchange, landowners would be asked to cover the remaining portion of those costs and to maintain the follow-up work on their property after the financial subsidy period. So this proposed approach represents a real shift in the rights, roles, and responsibilities of both landowners and the management agencies working with them. And the effectiveness of the approach will largely depend on its ability to meet with the perceptions and the needs of these stakeholder groups. However, these factors weren't very well understood. So we conducted a multi-stakeholder research assessment to understand the perspectives of private landowners, conservation professionals, and managers within the Working for Water program. And specifically, we looked at 3 questions. First, how do these groups perceive landowner and government responsibility for clearing invasive plants on private land? 2, how do they support the use of a combination of incentives and disincentives? And 3, to what extent do they think that the proposed subsidy of Working for Water's program would be sufficient to overcome landowners' financial barriers to clearing invasive plants on their property? So study methods, we used online surveys to collect information from conservation professionals. And this is, these professionals are experts in the fields of conservation and invasive plant management from a variety of governmental and non-governmental organizations, and also to collect information from Working for Water managers. For landowners, I conducted face-to-face interviews with 113 landowners in 3 study areas throughout the Western Cape. Now, these areas were purposefully selected because they represented variation in factors known to be important for invasive plant management, and because they were identified by Working for Water as potential pilot sites for their project. So each one of the study tools combined both open and closed questions. So with closed questions, respondents were given options of categories to choose from. And with open questions, we simply asked them to please describe what they thought. Throughout the process, we continuously talked with individuals and groups from each of the stakeholder groups to make sure that our research was appropriate for the Western Cape and to report on our findings as they came out. So just to give a sense of the 3 study areas, the first one is wilderness. It's primarily a residential area. It's smaller land holdings, about on the average 6 hectares in size, and these land holdings are interspersed with public parklands. The second area is Crabo, and Crabo is an area of intensive agriculture, primarily fruit agriculture. And the third area is Citrustal, and Citrustal is another intensive agricultural area, citrus fruits and rooibos. And some differences within Citrustal is it's a more arid site than the other areas. So the invasive plants are concentrated along waterways in Citrustal. Additionally, Citrustal is a long-term working for water project site. So these landowners have more experience clearing invasive plants. So what we found, remember our first question is how these stakeholders view government and landowner responsibility for clearing invasive plants on private land. And what we found is that out of the conservation professional, working for water manager, and landowner groups, the large majority of stakeholders saw a shared responsibility amongst landowners and the government. And this supports the development of a collaborative approach for clearing invasives. However, when we look at differences amongst the landowner study sites, we find although the majority of landowners saw a shared responsibility, landowners really differed in the amount of responsibility they are willing to assume across these areas. Okay, so if we look, we find that in the wilderness study area, the large percentage of landowners thought that they themselves had the primary responsibility. Whereas in Citrustal, they saw a much larger percent of the responsibility belonging to the government. So in order to understand these differences better, I looked at landowners' responses to open-ended research questions. And I looked to see if there was any associations between those responses and landowner study site. And what I found is that wilderness landowners consistently mentioned invaded public lands in their discussions of responsibility. Remember, they're neighboring a lot of public parks lands, and they said if there's still invasive plants on the public parks, the government shouldn't be responsible for then clearing these species on private property, and thus landowners have the majority of the responsibility. In contrast, remember in Citrustal, invasive plants are concentrated along waterways. And what these landowners said is that properties along rivers bear a disproportionate cost for clearing invasive plants without receiving additional resource benefits. So water is a public resource in South Africa. So these landowners along rivers have a lot of the responsibility for clearing invasives, but don't necessarily receive a greater proportion of those water resource benefits. And those landowners thought the government had a larger portion of the responsibility for doing the work. So when I asked these stakeholders about policy tools, the main take-home message from this slide is that the large majority of stakeholders agreed that legal mandates, financial incentives, and management assistance are needed to engage private landowners in clearing invasive plants on their property. And this provides strong support for a policy mix that combines incentives and disincentives. And finally, the final question regarded, well, how do these stakeholders perceive the proposed financial incentive by working for water? And do they think it's sufficient to overcome landowners' barriers to clearing invasive plants on their property? So they're giving choices. They could choose whether they thought it was fully sufficient, somewhat sufficient, or not at all sufficient. And what we find is that the majority of conservation professionals and working for water managers thought the subsidy would be somewhat sufficient, whereas the landowners were much more strongly divided. So if we look more closely at just the landowner's response, again, we see some important differences across the landowner study sites. And if we focus our attention just on the dark blue bars, we see that a much larger proportion of wilderness and Citrustal landowners thought the subsidy would be not at all sufficient as compared to Crabo. And again, I looked at landowners' responses to the open-ended questions to try and understand these differences a little bit better. And what I found is that wilderness landowners said they prefer to work more slowly, that the fixed 4-period time frame was too short a period, and they were concerned that that time frame would lead to the large-scale removal of invasive plants across the landscape relatively rapidly, and that this might have some non-target effects on wildlife that had perhaps come to depend on the trees, and it would also affect landowners' ability to use the wood as it was removed. And this picture, although you can't see it very well, is a picture of a landowner who built their entire home out of wood that they used from invasive plants. So they're concerned about a larger suite of ecosystem services than the policy considered. Whereas in citrus-style, I found a very different response. Now, what citrus-style landowners said is, we're concerned that the fixed policy timeframe doesn't account for stochastic and ecological unpredictability. We know that we can't predict necessarily what's going to happen with invasive plant management. We don't know that a strict four-period timeframe is going to be sufficient. Invasive plants might respond differently to control treatments, and there might be a fire or other type of disturbance that comes in and stimulates the invasive plant seed bank and leads to their reinvasion. So these landowners were concerned they could potentially find themselves back to square one due to a reinvasion after the subsidy period and no longer have the benefits of working for water's assistance. And this shows the picture of a landowner who had completely cleared their property from invasive plants, and then a fire came through a year later. And acacia species have a long-lived seed banks that's stimulated by fire. So within 2 years, they find themselves dealing with another invasion that they hadn't anticipated. Another important finding was I looked at to see if there were any themes associated with landowners who had experienced clearing invasive plants with those who hadn't had any experience. And in this case, I took into account study site within the analysis. And what I found is the theme, assuming that the subsidy would be adequate, was associated with landowners who didn't have experience. So landowners were willing to engage in the policy, and they often said, well, I don't really know, but I assume that it'll be okay, so I'll go ahead and do it. And this represents a potential challenge if landowners don't have realistic expectations of what will be required from them to maintain the follow-up work on their property over the long term. So in summary, we found strong stakeholder agreement with the proposed approach. Stakeholders generally saw shared responsibility amongst working for water and landowners, and they supported a policy mix that combines incentives with disincentives as ways of engaging private landowners in clearing invasive plants on their property. However, one size did not fit all. There were strong differences in perceptions across the landowner study areas, and particularly the proportion of public and private lands in the landscape, and whether invasive plants were distributed along just riparian areas or whether they were distributed across the landscape in both riparian and in uplands were key characteristics influencing landowners' perceptions of their and their government's responsibility for clearing invasive plants. Additionally, landowners mentioned that they considered a broader suite of ecosystem services that was currently being considered in the approach, particularly the effects of wildlife habitat and the use of wood resources from the invasive species. And landowners were concerned that a fixed policy timeframe didn't account for stochastic or unpredictable ecological change that they know to be associated with invasive plant management. And finally, communication and clear expectations for those landowners without experience to make sure that they know what will be required of them over the long term, so that Working for Water doesn't end up applying these incentives on properties that haven't secured adequate resources to maintain the work over time. So in conclusion, stakeholder analysis was an effective means of identifying opportunities and constraints that face an ecosystem service project on private lands. And landowner perceptions were strongly linked, actually, to the socio-ecological systems in which they lived. So stakeholder analysis is an important first step in developing these types of programs and policies that can be used to guide management decisions. And also, we collected this information prior to policy implementation. And thus, this information can be used as a baseline to track changes in perceptions over time. Thank you all for listening, and thank you also to the multiple partners who helped to work on this project, including my collaborators at the Center for Invasion Biology at the University of Stellenbosch, Heidi Przeski and Karen Essler. The Working for Water program was an integral partner in this research, and particularly Guy Preston, Derek Milan, and Ahmed Khan. I had field assistants from Anton Howe, Michelle Peens, and Madeleine Mouton, and thanks especially to all the conservation professionals and the landowners who took the time to participate in this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. So our next speaker in this session is Julie Combs, who is a recent, this year, 2011 graduate from the School of Forest Resources, and she has a BS from the University of California, Davis in environmental biology and resource management, and a MS from the University of Washington. and her research is focused on factors that limit rare plant species, and she also received an NSF IGERT fellowship that enabled her to conduct international research in China and South Africa and Chile, and she's going to tell us about her experience in Chile, and the title of her talk is Influence of Introduced Bumblebees on Native Flora and Fauna in Chilean Forests. Julie.
I'm excited today to tell you a little bit of my research finding from a piece of my dissertation work. Unlike what Lauren presented, she had this very intricate, very complicated sort of multi-stakeholder group study. And today I'm going to show you more of a disciplinary approach looking at conservation issues in Chile, in particular looking at the effects of introduced bumblebees in Chilean temperate forests. And just a couple of images from my research site. Unlike the forests here, we have these beautiful coniferous forests. In Chile and south central Chile, the forests are dominated by mixed stands of deciduous and evergreen beech trees and cypress trees. All these images are from research sites, except the central image there by Carolina Morales, and she's one of my colleagues in Argentina, and I put that slide in there to remind me to tell you that the story I'm telling you about what's going on in Chile today with the effects of introduced bomba species have been studied extensively in Argentina and other places around the world. And Carolina Morales and her lab was one of the inspirations for the work in Chile. And my main reason for looking at the effects of bombas in Chile was the fact that really not much is known about what's going on with the effects of introduced bumblebees. And I wanted to find out if some of the similar outcomes were happening there. And so the two bumblebee host plants that I will be talking about today, I'm not talking about the overstory, the forests, but I'm looking at the understory. And two of the plants I'll be looking at is fuchsia and Alstroemeria aurea. And many of you might recognize both of these plant species. They're very popular with horticulturalists here in Seattle, and you'll find fuchsia and Alstroemeria in many, many Seattle gardens walking around neighborhoods. Fuchsia is an evergreen shrub, for those of you who aren't familiar, and it has these beautiful long tubular corollas that have lots of pollen and nectar that attract pollinator species. And Alstroemeria is in the lily family, and it's a rhizomatous herbaceous plant. The two bumblebees I'll be talking to you about today, Bombus ruderatus and Bombus terrestris. Bombus ruderatus was introduced in 1982 just outside of Santiago for the purpose of pollinating Trifolium pratense cover crop species. And Bombus terrestris was introduced in 1998, first for greenhouse purposes to pollinate tomato plants in greenhouse settings, and then used in the field for avocado pollination production. This is an example of the bee boxes, and you can go online and order these quite readily. I copied this just off the web this morning. Tripole is one company, and the bee box features as a corrugated plastic box, temperature insulation, has 3 colonies with the queen, 350 to 400 workers, and it comes with a bag with sugar solution until you get them to their source where they have lots of access to pollen and nectar. And you can see them installed in the greenhouse setting here to pollinate the tomato crop. The picture on the right is Bombus terrestris pollinating Trifolium pratense in its native habitat on a native species in England. Bombus terrestris is native to England as well as Bombus ruderatus, and Bombus ruderatus is actually somewhat of a rare plant, of a rare bee species in that country. So why are bumblebees being introduced worldwide? Not only in Chile, but in Bombus terrestris and ruderatus have been utilized in countries like South Africa and New Zealand and Mexico and Israel. Basically, they're very efficient pollinators. You think of Apis mellifera, or the common honeybee, as the main pollinator that we're used to seeing. But bumblebees not only can they visit more flowers per minute, they're more efficient, but they can also forage and pollinate in a wide range of temperatures. So you can find bumblebees foraging in below 30-degree weather oftentimes, and that's because of their form. They have a lot of fur or hair that keeps them nice and warm and enables them to forage in very, very cold temperatures. In Chile, there's only one native bumblebee, Bombus dalbami, and it's very morphologically distinguishable from the other two in that it has a solid orange pattern. And actually, I should go back to this slide just to show the morphological differences between ruderatus and terrestris. They're actually quite similar, except when you see them in the field, Bombus ruderatus on the right has 2 bands of yellow on its thorax, and it's quite a bit longer in shape versus the shorter, stouter form of terrestris. But you certainly can't miss the 2 species being able to distinguish it from the native species, which has a solid orange pattern to it. So there is only one native bumblebee species in southern Chile. There are quite a few other pollinators, but because bombus species are so efficient and crop production, the cost benefits of actually having bumblebees be introduced, the government made a decision that they would benefit from more bumblebees and to increase crop production. Just as a contrast, here in Washington State, we have over 20 bombus species just in eastern Washington alone. So having only one bumblebee species is quite unique, and it's not used to having other species in its genera to compete for resources and so forth. So some reasons why we should be concerned about introduced bumblebees: negative interactions with local bee fauna and flora, and these have all been documented in other parts of the world and have been recently summarized by Daphne in 2010. Big concern about the spread of parasites and pathogens. Actually, here in the United States, there's quite a few bumblebee species that are currently on the decline as a result of infections of parasites and pathogens. There's also concern about genetic contamination with other bombus species, and finally, increased pollination of exotic weeds is also thought to be increased. And the lower picture here in the right-hand corner is Bombus terrestris pollinating a non-native thistle at one of my sites, research sites. I had 2 very basic questions. One, I wanted to know how introduced bumblebee species interact with native plant species and how they interact with native bumblebee species. And not only how they interact, but what are some of the consequences and effects of those interactions. And to answer these questions, I had 5 different sites in central southern Chile, and 2 of the sites, Valdivia and Lago Ranco, Bombus dalbami, which is the native orange species, and Bombus terrestris co-occurred at these 2 sites. In Chacao and Senda Darwin, that was the site where only the native bee species occurred, and this was a really important site because it enabled me to sort of compare and contrast behavioral patterns and interactions with the native plant species with the other sites to see if there were any influence with the non-native species. And the 5th site, San Pablo, this is where all 3 species co-occurred together, all occurring in central Chile, and Chilean Island in Senda Darwin. The sort of it's about 300 miles, just to give you a sense of the distance from Valdivia to Chilean Island. Now, my first very simple question was, and this was in the field, sort of casual observations, I was constantly seeing the introduced species much more often than the native species. So I did a series of monitoring and did a count in all the sites. And where you see the dash bar, that's just showing that bee wasn't present at that site. So in Valdivia, Bombus terrestris, 78 versus 4, Lago Ranco, 69 versus 6. The 2 sites where only the native bee species occur, you see that the numbers jump dramatically, 65 and 38 in comparison to the sites where you find it with the introduced species. And in San Pablo, a similar trend in the introduced species is much higher in abundance than the native species. To obtain these numbers, what I did was I had 3 days at each of these sites during the middle of the flight season where bees were the most active and the most abundant, and I walked transects from 100 to 150 meters in length and counted bees at those sites, and these are just mean numbers you're seeing. So these are sort of snapshots in time. At one site, I was able to do long-term monitoring of abundance over time. And this graph shows you on the y-axis, you see mean number per plant. So this is mean number of bumblebees per plant. In this case, I was monitoring it on fuchsia. And below on the x-axis, you see the monitoring period starting in January through April. And we see a similar trend over the long-term season in that the introduced species is much higher in abundance than the native species, except when we get closer to about March 13th date and the numbers drop off precipitously, and that's because fuchsia is senescing and the bees are actually moving on to different host plants. So that's why we see that downward trend. One of the more interesting behavioral interactions with the fuchsia and Bombus terrestris is that rather than pollinating, extracting nectar and pollen and pollinating the plant in the process, Bombus terrestris actually behaves as a pollen robber. And in the pollination world, we talk about pollen robbers or illegitimate visitors, and these are visitors that instead of pollinating the process, what this species does is it will insert its proboscis at the top part of the corolla where the nectar is stored, and it will just bite a hole with its mandibles and insert its proboscis and extract the nectar. And in the process, there's no pollination, so it just steals the nectar. So we call these pollen robbers. And it's an example of robbed and unrobbed flowers. They're pretty easy to distinguish. The robbed flowers have little holes at the top of their corolla. And in both of the sites where Bombus terrestris occurs, really extraordinarily high rates of robbery in these plant species, fuchsia. Even more fascinating to me as a pollination biologist was the fact that in the sites where the native bee co-occurs with the non-native bee, it actually adapts its pollen robbing behavior. So in the sites, Valdivia and Lago Ranco, where they co-occur, Bombus terrestris acts as an exclusive pollen robber, and 96 to 99% of the time, Bombus dalbami, the native bee, will also act as a pollen robber, and it's a secondary robber, so it won't actually make the holes. So it will go to the hole that Bombus terrestris made and take the nectar. And the way plants work is they don't just produce one nectar load and that's it. Over time, they'll produce nectar through the life of the flower. And for fuchsia, it's anywhere between 1 or 3 days for the recharge rate. So once the hole's there, the next day there'll be nectar available. So they'll be visiting these flowers again and again. In the sites, the 2 sites on on Chiloé Island, Senda Darwin and Chacao, Bombus dalbami, the native bee, 100% of the time only acts as a mutualist. So it won't make a hole, it will behave, it will perform the service of pollination, so it will enter the corolla from the base to extract the nectar and pollinate in the process. Now, the reason Bombus terrestris is nectar robbing is because its tongue length is not long enough to reach the floral nectar resources in the long tubular corolla of the fuchsia. Bumblebees vary in their tongue length. Some are long-tongued, some are short-tongued. Bombus terrestris is a short-tongued bee, and Bombus dalbami is a long-tongued bee. So Bombus can actually reach those resources and hence acts as a mutualist under natural conditions without interaction with a non-native bee. So what are the consequences for plant species? It has this effect on the native bee. So for plants that are pollen limited, there are potential negative effects with lower reproduction, fruit and seed reproduction. And I did a small experiment where I looked at fruit production in just regular, just under control conditions, so naturally, how many fruits are produced on this plant versus when I add pollen to the stigmas, and you can see the stigma, I've just added pollen to one of the stigmas in the middle picture there. Do you get increased fruit production? Because if you do, Then it does, in this case, 36% increase in fruit production when pollen added. So this tells me that if you're taking Bombus dalbami away as a mutualist pollinator, there is some consequences, potentially negative consequences for fruit production and success in Fuchsia magellanica. I also wanted to know how fast are these bees foraging to sort of get a glimpse of the competitive nature of foraging for pollen and nectar. And Bombus ruderatus on Alstroemeria visits 18 flowers per minute, and Bombus terrestris, Bombus dalbami, not much difference in their foraging rates. 18 doesn't seem like much from 13 and 12, but these are means, and so the highest ruderatus, I think up to 27 flowers a minute was ruderatus's highest, the most flowers it would visit, which is quite a bit more than the other two. So in theory, it is gaining more resources compared to the other two, so there is most likely some negative competitive outcome for the native bee, as well as Bombus terrestris. For Fuchsia magellanica, there was no difference in the Valdivia and Lago Ranco populations where the non-native terrestris and the native dalbami occurred. Very, very similar, but interestingly in Chile, Bombus dalbami visited significantly less flowers per minute compared to when it co-occurs with the non-native species. And my theory behind why that difference is in the first two populations, Bombus terrestris and Bombus dalbami are both foraging as nectar robbers. So they both have the same foraging pattern, whereas in the Chiloé sites, Bombus dalbami is foraging as a mutualist, which takes longer. So instead of landing right on the top of the corolla tube and inserting your proboscis into that hole, the insect actually has to go from the bottom, clasp onto the sepals, and investigate the corolla for resources. So it does take longer per minute to visit flowers. I have a couple conclusion slides, and in the presence of introduced bees, native bees steal nectar rather than pollinate. Introduced bees are more abundant, and ruderatus visits more flowers compared to the native bee. And finally, some bigger questions I have. Those were short-term sort of responses, but I'm curious about the long-term effects of these bees and how will introduced species affect other understory plant species. And quite potentially, the next question I have is, could Bombus dalbami, the native species, be used in pollinating as a pollinator in commercial crop production? And there's been one study that I found that has actually shown that it is a quite efficient pollinator. And so I have a lot of questions about why that hasn't been investigated further, and hopefully future research will collaborate with the government to investigate that. Thank you very much, and just lots of collaborators in Chile and also Argentina. Thanks very much.